30 years of that time he spent as editorial page editor. During his career, he's had many assignments: Middle East, India, Russia, and China. He's conversed with hundreds of prominent newsmakers, including John McCain, Hillary Clinton, John Glenn, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Madeleine Albright. He has been a frequent guest on radio and television stations, and we are here today to talk about his most recent book, Piercing the Veil, a skeptical journalist discovers unseen worlds. And I'd like to give the happy disclaimer that I have known Kingsley for more than 30 years. He was my boss for 23, give or take, years on the editorial board. And during that time, he really taught me a lot, and this will be a great conversation today. So just wanted to put that out there, how happy I am to be on the opposite side. He'll be getting asked the questions today instead of being the reporter that he has been in journalists. And just to start off, hi Kingsley, how are you?
Hello, Diana.
Good to have you here today.
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. You're looking really well. The next book of life has really treated you great.
I'm feeling good.
Ask you in starting off, just tell us a little bit more just about the book, and then we can go from there. What do we need to know?
Okay, well, I want to thank you for arranging this. History Cares, History Fort Lauderdale. So lucky to have you. She did a great job. Diana did a great job with the Sun Sentinel, and those people she said that I talked to, she set up many of the interviews with many of those people. So it was a great, Judy Borich, who was published the first edition of my novel, Queen of the Heavens. Craig Stenger, a high school buddy, so we're going way back. But anyway, I'm here to talk about, and other people, Dick Ott, and of course, Lynn Bacharach, who good friends, Piercing the Veil, a skeptical journalist discovers unseen worlds. And a little bit about this book, how it came about. I did a enhanced republication of my novel, enhanced with some artwork inside and cover, Queen of the Heavens, set in ancient Egypt. And in that book, I analyzed some of the mysterious or mystical events that had taken place in my life. And as I gave book talks, rather than talking about the book set in ancient Egypt, I talked about these mystical experiences, and the people in the audience were transfixed by so many of these. And I said, maybe I ought to just write a book on these experiences. So the novel took years to write, but I sat down in North Carolina on the porch of Lynn's house. And within 6 weeks, I had the first draft of this book, and Lynn has published it, and very proud of it. Anyway, how did it come about, and what is it about? Well, it starts out at the beginning. It's a spiritual memoir, about 29 vignettes in it, but I start out at the beginning talking about an event that took place when I was 19 years old. I was a student in South Korea. I had come from a very chaotic household. My mother was schizophrenic, and I was overseas as a student in South Korea. And one night I had this feeling of a presence in my room, and I was scared out of my wits. I never had this feeling before. Terrified. I checked under the bed, under the cover, or under in the closet, looked out the window. I probably had no idea why. At about 4 in the morning, a call came in from Cleveland, Ohio, telling me my mother had committed suicide, which was quite a shock. Now, what was this presence? I don't know. Didn't know. Still don't know. But it at least gave me the thought that maybe there are things that exist in this world that are not linked to the material world. That there are maybe a spirit world, maybe not. I don't know. It was one of those things that just an event I didn't really think too much about as my life went on. My journey at this point took me through all the way through into India. It took me around the world, but I got to India, and I got 20 years old at this point. I'm in the sacred city of Benares on the Ganges River. If you see the pictures of people going down to the river to bathe, that's probably Varanasi, one of the most sacred cities on earth. And I don't really have much of a spiritual sense about me, but I was just transfixed by this city. And I'm going, standing outside the Golden Temple, one of the most sacred sites for Hindus in all of India, and a throng of people are marching into the temple. And I couldn't go in because I was not a Hindu, but I had the sense that this could have been 500 BCE. The Buddha could have been preaching outside of Benares, as he did at that point. Just an incredible experience. I'm standing among the throng of people, and I feel something in my hand. An old woman hands me a fistful of flowering sacred cow. The cow eats the petals. And whoo, some sort of a jolt went through me, almost an electric jolt. Like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. I could be here 500 BCE and it would have been the same. And I made a pledge at that point. Someday I will return to this exact place. So anyway, life goes on. I get home, but before I could honor that pledge, I had a complete and total emotional collapse, linked, I think, largely to my childhood and my mother's death. And couldn't really walk around the block. I was so frightened. But at that time, I really discovered alcohol. And this is not a book about recovery from alcoholism, but I started my drug. It got me through life, got me out of my chair, got me into the profession of newspapers, and had an extremely successful career as I came down to South Florida and the Sun Sentinel. And life looked from the outside and realized that alcohol had turned on me, that I was alcoholic. And as many of you may know, recovery from alcoholism often requires some sort of a spiritual awakening or no spiritual sense about me. But I said, it's life or death. I either pursue a spiritual life or I die. So at this point, I said, it's time to go back to India. It's time for me 20 years later to honor that pledge. And I went back to Benares, and full of enthusiasm for the spiritual adventure I was on. And I get to Mumbai, not Bombay, called Mumbai now, and was just overwhelmed by the poverty and the so much maps at that point. I got to Benares, and again, just seeing all the sights and all the misery, and I just couldn't take it. I said, there can't be a God. God would not allow this to exist. So I honored my pledge. I went down to the Ganges. I went to the Golden Temple. I bought some flower petals. I fed them to a sacred cow, I thought, and expecting and hoping I'd get some sort of a spiritual renewal, but nothing. And I realized I'd fed a bull. So I bought some more flower petals, made sure it was a cow this time. I fed them, but still nothing. I'm distraught. And I go down to the river, and it's dusk, and I'm sitting on a bench, and I get hit from behind. I turned around, and here's a beggar with no arms. Wow. Just, oh my God, a leprous beggar. And there cannot be a God. There's thousands of people on the riverfront thinking this is the most spiritual place on earth, and I am absolutely feeling devastated, spiritually devastated. So anyway, it's one last try. I'll try floating a sacred devotional candle in the Ganges, which this candle set on some leaves, and the woman in front of me, several women, knelt at the Ganges edge and put the candles in, splashed their hands, and candles floated out about 15 feet away. And I kneel down, I say a prayer asking for spiritual renewal. I put the candle in the Ganges, I splash my hand. It goes out about 3-4 feet, and then a current catches it and comes back towards me, towards the bank. And I am just beside myself saying, I've come halfway around the world to have a spiritual experience, and I can't even float a candle on the Ganges properly. And at the instant of that thought, 3-inch frog surfaced from the muddy Ganges, grabbed the plate in its left front leg, and swam it out to the other candles and deposited it in the middle where it burnt more brightly than all the rest. At that point, it was, whoa. I was baptized Catholic, although I never practiced the religion. I didn't know what to do. I put my hand in the Ganges and I genuflected. And as I walked past, back to my boarding house, past the funeral pyres on the Ganges, I said to myself, hey, I am on the right track. And it was that event with the frog that took me into various spiritual directions, largely dealing with the Eastern spiritual thinking, although I had utter. So that was, events like that is what the book deals with. One of the, so many things in my life happened like that. And I'm going to relate one more. It deals with a frog again. This was about 6 years ago, or not 6, about 5 years ago. I'm sitting in my meditating one day, and I get this message: visit the graves of your paternal grandparents. I hadn't been there for 50 years. And what? Why would I do that? And I couldn't get this thought out of my mind. Well, I wasn't about to leave Fort Lauderdale to Cleveland just because I had this crazy thought, but more synchronicities and circumstances conspired to get me up to the cemetery in Cleveland where they were buried, Lakeview Cemetery, huge cemetery. And a fellow from the office helps me find the grave, and I walk over to it and I look down at this flat tombstone, and there's a piece of bark over my grandfather's name. And I stooped down to brush it away before I say a prayer. And I looked and it moved. This was not a piece of bark. It was a little tree frog that hopped off the gravestone and disappeared into the grass like the other frog had grabbed my candle from the Ganges and then disappeared into the water again. And it was like, whoa. Now, this launched me on another direction and quest for answers, and got me into talking to psychics and talking to mediums and attending seances. And when I say seance, I mean the physical seances where things fly around the room and apparitions may appear and such, and it all sounds crazy. It all sounds crazy, but so much had happened to me that I was willing to explore anything. And these took place right in Fort Lauderdale, hosted at the Metaphysical Chapel in Fort Lauderdale. So there was one German medium coming. I'd seen him before, and it was but I was trying to generate some enthusiasm for me to continue writing my second novel, trying to get some creativity in my life. And there was a Vedic principle that you repeat a mantra 108 times for 41 straight days, and what you are seeking will get moving on the second novel. So I said a mantra to the Hindu goddess Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge and creativity. And Saraswati is always pictured sitting on a lotus holding a stringed instrument called a veena, kind of like a lute, and with a swan nearby. And, but I said, did this mantra 41 straight days, 108 times, simple mantra, but did it, well, I'd say religiously, every day. And I go to this, it was a table levitation with this medium from Germany. And it was in a darkened room, and there were two sittings. First, I was in the second sitting. But all you could hear in the darkened room was these oohs and ahs coming from the table. And then it became my turn. I'm sitting next to my friend and Sun Sentinel colleague, John Dolan, and hands on the table, and whoa, the table shakes, and the table rises and rises and falls and rises and falls. Whoa, just kind of crazy, but it all happened. And afterwards, we're standing in the dark, and the medium has us stand and hold hands. And he says, I feel something coming through. I feel something coming through. Squeeze. Nothing. Let's squeeze again. Plop. Something drops on the table. So his assistant came with a flashlight, looking at this little item about that big. And somebody says, it looks like a bullet. No, so it looks like a little statue, just passing it around, passing it around. It came to me, and I looked at it, and this was the statue. And it had appeared. Don't know if you can see it, but right there. Can't probably make out too much of it, but I was the only person on the table who recognized what it was. It was a tiny statue of the goddess Saraswati, who appeared somehow from another dimension. My knees buckled. I had to sit down. It was maybe the most mind-blowing experience of my life. I had asked for creative juices to flow. Instead, I am shown an actual icon of the goddess, which did get my juices flowing. It helped me to get going again on the second book and caused me to write this book. So that's basically what the book is about, all these experiences that I had. There's 29 chapters, and I tried to keep the book very short. It's about 15,000 words. Tried to keep it short because I think people's attention spans are these days, short books I tend to, I think, be more powerful. But all of this was, the appearance of the goddess was the culmination, but it's just a book of so many stories similar to this and similar to the frog and the Ganges and the frog and the gravestone. That's what it's about. And I think, and by talking about Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, who said to Horatio, there's more to heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. So anyway, I'm not a guru. I'm not preaching any religious dogma. I am coming at this as a skeptical reporter, skeptical journalist, and I'm still a skeptic. I think there's a lot of nonsense going on out there. But this events in this book were written by a journalist who had a pretty good reputation in South Florida for his integrity, and every word in it is true. So anyway, I'll pass this back to Diana and open it to any questions she may have and anything other people may have.
Well, thank you, Kingsley. That was very enlightening and very informative. Let me ask you this. How can one pierce the veil and know rather than believe that unseen worlds really do exist? And also, are you reluctant at any time to talk about the mystifying events in your life for fear that, you might be called crazy?
Well, I had that concern, not so much a fear that I'd be called crazy, because I knew I was a little crazy anyway, so that didn't bother me. But as a journalist, I was in a pretty visible position in the Sun Sentinel, and after I retired full time, I also wrote a column. These were not anything that I could talk about while I was in the Sun Crier. Can you imagine me going into Gene asking, where are you going on vacation? King say, I'm going up to an ashram in New York State. I'm going to meditate and chant and go through Vedic rituals with Brahmin priests. I mean, these are things I really could not talk about in the
Definitely
news.
not Gene.
My friend John. Yeah, not Gene. My friend John Dolan was the arts and entertainment editor I was able to talk about him, and I quote him in my book, and he is, but I couldn't talk about it. So I kept it very quiet, my pursuits. But after, so many things had happened, I retired. I no longer had the journalistic restraint. Governors, senators, admirals, captains of industry. You really have to maintain some sort of let's say, a demeanor that is not one that might cause people to think that you are a little bit nuts. So, but I'm not constrained by that anymore, which is why I wrote this book. I think it was important to get this information out there. Now, the first question you asked was what on that?
How does one pierce the veil and know rather than believe?
I think
that there is an unseen world.
Yeah, and I think the great religions of the world have techniques that people have been using for centuries, millennia. Certainly, meditation is important, but I think the most important thing to me was following what's known as synchronicities. What Carl Jung, I think, coined the phrase synchronicities. These coincidences with meaning. And the book largely deals with these coincidences that led me places, like the coincidences of the frog in the Ganges and the coincidence of the frog on the gravestone. And this sent me on the spiritual path that brought me to the point that I am now, where it's not a question of believing in all of this, it's knowing, absolutely knowing that all this exists. So if I could give any, like I said, I'm not a guru, I'm not trying to push anything spiritually or religiously, but if I could give any piece of advice, is follow the synchronicities and be aware that these are real and these are happening and that there is something going on within the matrix of universal existence that is giving us some guidance and direction into where our life ought to go.
Yeah. Someone asked, was there one event that you can point to that has shaped your spiritual journey the most? And that was from Joanne Lewis. Was there one event?
I believe that one event was the one I described over in India. 20 years, when I was 20 years old, the sacred cow eating the flower petals from my hand and causing me to make that pledge to someday return to India. And if I may, let me just, I think I got it right here. I'm just going to give a short reading from the book, if I may, dealing with that. I felt a nudge and looked down as a tiny woman, ancient in appearance, dressed in a tattered white sari. She looked up at me, smiled a toothless smile, and uttered words in her native tongue. She grasped my arms, placed flower petals in my hand, and directed it to the mouth of a passing sacred cow. The animal relished eating the petals. As I felt the animal's tongue in the palm of my hand, an electric jolt ran through me. My entire being filled with joy of a quality I had never known, and I issued a silent pledge. Someday I shall return to this very spot, feed flower petals to a sacred cow. I turned to thank the woman, but she had disappeared into the crowd, or perhaps she had just disappeared. India, the country that travelers had told me to avoid, had captured my imagination, or was it my soul? I was still a skeptic, not a seeker. As I walked through the narrow streets of Varanasi back to my lodging, I reaffirmed the pledge I had just made. I had no way of knowing that 20 years hence, that pledge would change my life. Wow. So that event, coupled with the event 20 years later, when I am beside myself with despair, thinking that I was, spiritual stuff was all nonsense. But then at that same place, having that frog grab the candle in the Ganges and swim it to the other candles. It was that that sparked me to say, I'm on the right track. Let's keep pursuing this. There is more to this world than we're able to experience through the five senses. So those two, and another interesting coincidence or synchronicity. I returned home, not knowing, at least consciously knowing, I returned home the second time, 20 years to the day that I returned home from my first trip to India. 20 years to the day. And those are just the synchronicities, the coincidences with meaning that make you think, hey, what's going on here? Well, of course, skeptics will say, deep in your mind, you knew it was that day. But maybe, but I don't think so. I did not plan this with any conscious intent on that respect.
Very good. I'm looking in the chats, and we mentioned Gene Cryer in passing, and we know who he was, but can you just explain or tell the people who Gene Cryer was to us?
Yeah, some of us knew Gene very well. Gene was the executive editor of the Sun Sentinel for many, many, many years. Charlene knew Gene. Others on here did. Gene was like I said, the executive editor. He was, let's say, kind of a throwback in some respects to the editors of old. He was a no-nonsense guy, and he was the person who I think really took the Sun Sentinel and turned it into a very, very fine newspaper that it became. And got a lot of respect for Gene. I owe him a lot. He promoted me, took a chance on me, made me editorial page editor. I was only 36. They used to call me the boy editorial page editor. I never learned that until after I'd retired, but that's, that's what they called me. Gene was quite a guy.
And someone else wanted to know.
Anything else?
When did you realize you had a drinking problem, or that there was, you drank and you were able to stop? When did you realize there was a way out?
I realized when I was 40 years old. I had a heck of a 40th birthday party. And the next day, I'm sitting in my office. My head is spinning. And my brother had been, I had alcoholism in my family, and it was like a moment of clarity. Your alcoholism throughout your entire family. I'm not talking a few people, I'm talking everybody. And I said, what would make you think that you could escape this? And it was that moment of clarity, and it scared me. And that was what got me into an organization that talked about the spiritual awakenings and spiritual journeys. And it was that got me on it. Wasn't easy. It was not easy by any stretch of the imagination. It was the toughest thing I ever did. But it was the most important thing I ever did in my life. And there is a way out. Like I said, this book is not about recovery from alcoholism. It's about the spiritual journey that I took that led to recovery. Spiritual, so far, really, spiritual transformations are certainly the most effective, if not the only way to effectively deal with drinking problems.
And that helped you to be who you are. That's part of the process. That's part of the journey, to get to this place.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, you look back and you say, oh, if only, but then you realize I am what I am because of this. This book would not have been written. My novel would not have been written if it weren't for the fact that I had to go through this very trying and difficult part of my life. Life is not easy.
No, it's not.
But life is full of challenges for everyone.
Yes, it is.
That was the challenge that I had the biggest challenge in my life. Yeah.
There was a chapter in your book, I wrote this down, chapter 18, and to be precise, page 93. You talked about samadhi. After
Mhm.
my samadhi experience, I could never look at
Mhm.
life or death quite the same way again, for I knew there was a higher reality, a part of me that transcends both birth and death. Can you explore that?
Yeah, the samadhi experience, that's a Sanskrit word,
Mhm.
and it is that state where the veil between your consciousness and what we might say cosmic consciousness disappears. And you will become associated with the totality of existence. Time ceases to matter. Fear is gone. Uh, there's a term in Sanskrit, Satchitananda, existence, knowledge, and bliss. It's a state of union, put it this way, union with the Godhead. And I was in it for about 4 hours, but 4 hours measured by the clock, but you really, it's not something in which time exists. And I fictionalize it in my novel, Queen of the Heavens, where the protagonist goes into this state and she makes the statement, I could have stayed like this for eternity. And then I realized I was eternity. So it's a description, it's something that is really impossible to accurately describe because there are no words to really express it, but it's the most profound experience that I've ever had, certainly the most profound state of consciousness. Now, there's also a chapter, I believe the next one is called The Astronaut, and it deals with the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, who I knew. Dick Ott, who's here today, was a friend of his, and he introduced me to Dick. Edgar. I did a story on him for the Sun Sentinel. We had some other subsequent in-depth conversations. But he entered that state on the way back from the moon, spontaneously. And here's an MIT astrophysicist, and he had no idea what had happened to him, but he got back, and his scientific mind says, I have to find out what was going on here. So he started the scientific investigation of the spiritual experience and established what still is in existence, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which studies these phenomena, some of which I have talked about and I've experienced. So what's the basis of these things? And his belief was the old Cartesian Newtonian paradigm. Religion is religion, secular is secular, God is God, man is man, keep the two separate. And Newtonian deterministic physics was the way that our physics shaped our understanding of the world. He said, hey, this paradigm is breaking down with the new physics, with relativity, with quantum mechanics. We've got to, that it's time to merge the wisdom of the ages that you find through some of the traditional spiritual and religious movements with the new sciences, that these are not contradictory, that these can be looked upon in totality, and that we need to start accepting that the two are not antagonistic. So it was quite a experience knowing him. Interesting story. I'm sitting in his study, and the first time I met him, and he hands me something that looks like the joystick to a cheap computer game, and he tells me, "That's the control stick to the lunar lander." Whoa! He and his companion Alan Shepard apparently cannibalized the lunar lander before sending it back crashing on the moon. They cannibalized it for souvenirs, and he had this. So here I am holding something in my hand. This house in Jupiter that had been to the moon and back. It was quite an experience, but he was quite a man. And his daughter, Kimberly, who was the executive director of the Everglades Trust, was kind enough to write an excellent foreword to the book. And I really appreciate her contribution to that. Also, you can go to my website. You can see Edgar in a video from Noetic Sciences, where he is coming back from the moon on the space capsule, and he's narrating and talking about the Samadhi experience. That's kingsleyguy.com. You can access it. That's my website, kingsleyguy.com.
Kingsley, have you felt like a spiritual outsider in an often non-spiritual world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think mentioned my life in the newspaper. It's not it's not its purpose, so let's say newspapers, to deal with the things that I talk about. The newspapers, back in the back in the day when people still read newspapers, and we were fortunate enough to work for a while back in those days, that yeah, did feel an outsider. But but then I do have a lot of acquaintances and friends who understand some of what I'm talking about and have had their own spiritual experiences. I think that the world may be at a cusp where people are starting to accept things a little bit more. I mentioned the deterministic physics of Isaac Newton. That sort of shaped much of our material ideas about existence. But quantum physics is changing so much of that. I actually pulled out a couple of quotes. For instance, a quote by the great physicist Max Planck. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So this whole idea of what is consciousness is really, I think, entering the popular consciousness. I'll quote Planck again. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this minute solar system of the atom together. You must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind.
Wow.
So here you've got one of the great quantum physicists of existence shaping in scientific terms what you might call God. The existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. What is that? Other than some sort of a intelligence beyond our material existence. So I think things are changing, and I think they're changing pretty rapidly as more of this comes into popular consciousness.
Yes, very good. This has all been very informative and enlightening. I'm sure that all of you feel that way. I'd like to open right now. Time is getting away from us. If there's anyone on this talk who'd like to ask Kingsley a question, you can just unmute yourselves and feel free to ask. All right, try to navigate here. Is there anyone?
Oh, don't be shy. Oh, there's Dick Ott.
Okay.
Not so much a question, because Kingsley and I have talked about all of this for years. Mm-hmm. And but for those of you who would like to explore this even more, in reference to what Kingsley was saying about is there a theoretical framework as to how this might work? One of the most famous quantum physicists was a man named Wolfgang Pauli, and he actually is considered one of the fathers of quantum physics. And he explored this quite extensively with Carl Jung, who Kingsley mentioned. And there is someone that I've very recently discovered who's taken it to the next level. And for those of you who might be inclined to entertain the opportunity to explore it, this man's name is Remo Roth. Remo Roth. And you can read quite a bit of the things he's written on academia.edu. And it's amazing how many things that I've recently read that reflect what Kingsley was talking about. And he actually has theories as to how you can enter into these states where you can have these experiences. And I think getting back to the question that was asked about what's the difference between belief and knowing, and the difference is experience. You know, as Kingsley emphasized, once you have one of these experiences, you have no need for belief anymore, because you know it. It's a mind-body experience that you may have no words to describe it, but you know it's real. And in fact, I think Kingsley would agree with me, it's more real than anything you'll ever experience in our everyday, profane, materialistic world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that Carl Jung said, we talked about this, I think you quoted it for me, I don't believe in God, I know there's a God. And Niels Bohr, another of the great pioneers of quantum physics, said, everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. I'm not sure what that means, but you know, the quantum physicists are looking into ideas of consciousness that does not separate consciousness from the idea of matter. As a matter of fact, you look at some of the ancient teachings, Vedic teachings, the idea of the Big Bang exists in Vedic literature, where everything began from a single point, the Bindu point, expanded into a play of consciousness. There's the idea of Indra's net, where in this net there's a jewel at each connection point of the net, and each jewel contains that of all the other jewels, sort of an idea of a holographic universe. There's the fundamental idea that all things are conscious, that consciousness exists in the rocks. I think, if I can recall the quote, I think Edgar Mitchell was fond of using it. God sleeps in the minerals, awakens in the plants, walks in the animals, and thinks in man. So, you know, the idea that consciousness is ubiquitous, not something that is contained up here in the brain. Consciousness is not the brain, but consciousness exists well beyond just the brain. Anyway, scientists are starting to look at these things. Not starting, they've been looking at them for the last 100 years, but I think now much of it is beginning to start entering more and more into popular consciousness.
Very good. Kingsley, I want to just quickly go to the chat. When we began the conversation, I mentioned some of the people that you've met and interviewed. One of them was Gorbachev. They want to know, what kind of person is he? Do you feel like he is authentic? And what was your most impactful assignment?
I would say that I was sitting, there was a small group of journalists. We were in Moscow at the Gorbachev Institute. This was after he had left the government. Mm-hmm. And when was it? 1999. I would say he was the most impressive political figure, and maybe the most, the most intelligent political figure I have ever met in my life. The man was more than genuine. He was incredible. I happened to be over there in 1999 when we were dropping bombs on the Serbs in that Balkan War. The Russians were not all that happy about him, since the Serbs were their allies for World War II and very close to the Serbs. That was one of the most, we were expecting 15 minutes from him. He gave us an hour and a half. It was the most interesting hour and a half that I have ever experienced talking to a political figure. So the man is brilliant. The translation, he spoke in Russian, but his translator was so adept, it was almost a simultaneous. Gorbachev would say something in Russian, it would come out of the translator in English. But you know, our ideas, I could get into a whole long political discussion. I have with, I see my friend John Hart, our former county commissioner, on Russia, and Russia's own need for defense. But yeah, he was totally genuine. He was brilliant. Margaret Thatcher said to Ronald Reagan, "We can deal with this man," and Reagan took her word for it, and they did, and it changed the world. So one of the most impressive, I would not say one of the, I would say the most impressive political figure I have ever met.
Awesome. Judy, did you have a question? No, okay. I saw you unmuted, so I thought you had a question. Anyone else?
Oh, what was your most impactful assignment?
Oh, my most impactful assignment. Well, let's see. Boy, there were a lot. You know, I think in that I was the editor of the editorial page rather than, and of course I did writing, but mostly in charge of the staff. There were two events. I think trying the 2001 election, where we were the epicenter of the whole thing, of the 537 vote difference between electing George W. Bush and Al Gore. So I think keeping the staff together and making rational commentary in a time where rationality seemed to be gone by the board very often, keeping things together for 6 weeks in the course of trying to get through all of that, where, like I said, Fort Lauderdale was the epicenter of the whole electoral mess. That I think was an important time for the Sun Sentinel. And I think we did a good job trying to bring reason and rationality to something where it was so politically divisive.
I concur.
Yeah, you were there too.
Well,
going in the middle of the night to change the pages for events that kept happening and happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've got another question here from the chat. And Charlene says she's thoroughly enjoyed your book, and she wants to know, how do you feel about reincarnation after your experiences?
Well, what did Woody Allen say? I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. You know, reincarnation is interesting thought. Does consciousness exist beyond the death of the body? And I believe it does. Yeah, I believe that a progression takes place and happens in our consciousness, whether on this plane or another plane. And it's interesting, I think the different attitudes and ideas, reincarnation is not something that is even questioned over in India or Japan or Korea or other countries that, where this is China, and where this is all part of the culture. But in the West, it's almost like, oh yeah, reincarnation. I want to come back as shortstop for the New York Yankees, or I want to come back as a great movie actress or actor. But in the West or in the East, it's a different idea. It's like, hey, let's get off this wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. Let's move up along the line. You know, some of the things that I mentioned at the end of the book about these seances I attended and communication with the dead. And I'll be starting a blog post, by the way, within not too long. And, one of my first blogs deals with a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a biologist in the end of the 19th century, second half of it, who co-discovered or co-formulated independently of Charles Darwin the idea of evolution through natural selection. And it used to actually be called the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. But Wallace came back from his travels in Asia to when the time of the spiritualist movement was really strong in the country. And he decided as a scientist he was going to study this, and because he felt he had a duty, you know, to study that. Maybe there's physical laws we don't know anything about that are causing these apparitions to appear and things to move seemingly under their own power. And he came out without contradicting evolution, came up with the theory of the progression of the fittest. And after we depart this earth, and there are other realms of existence in which we progress morally and onto different planes of existence. So the idea that consciousness ends with the body, I don't believe it does. We'll all know, well, maybe we won't know. If it doesn't, we won't know. If it does, we all will know. And my experiences are such that, yeah, consciousness is not limited to our physical shell, that it will go on, and it could come back, and that we do progress, whether in this plane of existence or other planes of existence.
Rodney Dillon had his hand raised. Rodney, do you want to ask a question? If you're there, you got to take yourself off mute, or maybe I can unmute you.
Try to raise your hand here. Hold on a minute.
Diana?
That's
No,
right.
I'm fine. I didn't know what made my hand raise.
Oh, okay. That's okay. We're very good.
Enjoying, just listening.
All right, very good. Anyone else?
Can you see?
All right, John Hart.
Yes. Kingsley, first of all, thank you again. You know, it's always so much fun to listen to you and to just learn again about the experiences. I learn something every time you speak about your book and your experiences. I have a question that you have been talking about with me for many, many years, and that's democracy and the dialogues in democracy that we have journeyed down now for almost 2 decades. Where do you think the consciousness that you have been speaking to fits into the entire conversation about self-government and being able to keep ourselves together in a conscious world with something that's intangible, like the thought of freedom and liberty?
Yeah, and thank you, John, for the question. John started years ago. John was a county commissioner. He was a mayor of North Lauderdale, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Very active in politics, and continues to be active with his dialogues in democracy, where he's attempting to get people, younger people in particular, involved in dialogues in improving our political systems and getting people involved in a rational discussion of politics. I think we're undergoing some type of fundamental shift in our consciousness, and going through this is going to create short-term havoc. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. How does we've been through it before. You take a look at the American Revolution, where it was a change of consciousness coming out of the Enlightenment, that people started thinking in different ways about hierarchies and structures of politics and equality of individuals. You are getting into a whole different scientific paradigm in which I think materialism is going to eventually, we're in a terribly materialistic world right now. I think eventually materialism may start diminishing in importance to people starting to realize the true value of and true meaning of what is important in life, including freedom of thought. If there's anything that frightens me right now is the attacks that are taking place in a lot of places, including academia, on the freedom of thought, freedom of expression. This really scares me, and if we're going to progress, we've got to start talking about things. And we've got to put them in the context of, I believe, freedom rather than authoritarianism, and we're at a turning point right now. I believe in freedom of conscience, freedom of the person to of their ability without fear of censure. And I'm hoping that we are experiencing an expansion of consciousness that will facilitate some sort of a movement into maybe higher consciousness in our political realm, rather than coming from maybe the lower power structure into more of a communication and efforts to enhance the individual's right to think freely. I hope.
Thank you.
Very good. Time is winding up. We see that the hour is going, and we just had a wonderful conference. I really enjoyed this. I really did. Before I turn it back over to our executive director, I just wanted to ask really quickly, I don't know if I'm breaking news here or not, but briefly, can you tell us how far you're planning on moving from Fort Lauderdale to the North Carolina mountains?
Yeah, well, I see John Hart and Dick Ott up in North Carolina, and of course Lynn Backrack up in North Carolina. Yeah, you know, it's one of those things. It kind of deals with what I wrote about years ago when I began my spiritual journey. I was reading about Hinduism and the description of the well-lived Hindu life. You start out as being born and getting an education, a young person. In your first third of life, and in your second third of life, you become quite a householder, where you start a family and you get a job. I never started a family, but I did have a job. But I was a householder in that second part of life, where you do your job to put a roof over your head and feed yourself. And the third part of life, you do what's known as enter sannyasa, which is to go into the woods and start preparing for whatever comes comes after this third phase of life. And I am just feeling, I'm not ready to become a sannyasin, as they say, and go live in a cave, but I am feeling this draw to becoming closer with nature, maybe getting into a location where you can experience the four seasons again, and just come in closer contact with the natural cycles of life. So that's sort of what is moving me. I do things have to fall in place before I'm able to do that. But that is my plan right at the moment anyway. And before we leave, I got to give myself a plug, of course. I do have a website, kingsleyguy.com. I will be starting a blog fairly soon. You can register on the website to be informed of when the blog and other things come out, and the books, both Piercing the Veil and my novel Queen of the Heavens, are available in various platforms. And best bet is Amazon, but they can be purchased to other places as well. So anyway, kingsleyguy.com is my website. If anybody wants to get personally in touch with me, kingsleyguy@bellsouth.net would be my email. So thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Diana. First of all, a very big thank you to you, Kingsley, for spending this time with us and sharing your contact information with all of our listeners. This meeting is being recorded via Zoom, so we will have this available on our YouTube channel. We do have a film company that does some editing on these things, so it won't be immediate, but it will be available to you. I know I purchased the books. I use Kindle religiously, so it was very simple on the Amazon process to get your books, and I'm enjoying this one very much. Again, this is for History Fort Lauderdale. I'm the executive director, and we are your history museum for Broward County, in business since 1962, and we are supported by members and other charitable organizations, family foundations, and significantly supported by government grants. If you are interested in our work, if you are retired and have time to support our work through maybe being an historian in residence or a writer in residence, be in touch with me or Diana at your convenience. And be sure to go on our website and look at the Donate Now and the membership page if that interests you as well. Please communicate with us via email at info@flhc.org if you have any questions for us. We'd love to hear from you, and hope you'll join us again. Next month's presentation is John Bailey. He's written a new book about the New River. He is one of our historians in residence, and some of you may have seen, I've shared some of the videos he's done on YouTube. He's just very entertaining and very connected to the history of Broward County. So he'll be with us next month, the second Thursday of the month at noontime as you have your lunch. Thanks so much for joining us.